I'm Gina Fitt, and you've either surfed to or purposely selected Life Talk with Vern Moses. Welcome to another in our ongoing series of verbal essays, as brought to you in this television format. Vern, on our last show we were talking about bereavement and how the grief that people bottle up inside themselves keeps them from being successful in their relationships and in their careers and in many areas of their lives. And I was hoping perhaps we could do a quick recap of what we covered last week and move on to the next portion of that.
Yeah, if I can just refer to the notes that we wrote. 2 shows ago, we talked at length about bottlenecks of bereavement, how bereavement comes from 2 primary sources, loss and lack. Losses, of course, are death and all the various kinds that impact us, and divorce and separation. Job and business. The loss of a job or business can be incredibly traumatic. Relocation. I experienced one just recently with my grandson, and if I hadn't had the tools to use, I can imagine I could have been much sadder, and it had a much greater impact on it than it did. Lost expectations, and then of course recognized lacks can cause bereavement. And then we went on to explain that somewhere in here we explained that the bottlenecks themselves are denial, anger, guilt, negotiation, and transference. And what we were saying is that if some of these get stuck, they can trap all of these other elements inside of us, and they'll manifest themselves with inappropriate behavior, sort of a frozen life, if you would. And I've seen it time and time again, and perhaps this evening we'll give some more illustrations. I remember the last time we talked about Jerry, a fellow named Jerry, who 44 years was still in bereavement for his daddy, who had died when he was only 3. Now, people might say, well, yeah, but that's unsophisticated, that's not going to happen to me, I'm too intelligent for that, and this type of thing. And we say, be careful, be careful.
Now, do we tend to go through these feelings in a particular order, or does it change for different people?
I think it changes for different people. Some are more obvious. Some people accept readily, and yet they still are very angry that it occurred and what have you. It could happen in any order, and we have to be careful of that. We do know, though, that these symptoms, if you would, denial and anger and guilt, are fear symptoms. They're based on fear. Our life has been impacted. It's not ever going to be the same again, and we're fearful about that. And so, and you know what fear can do to us. Time and time again, we've talked about inappropriate behavior and being dysfunctional, if you would, and our relationships, our careers not moving forward the way they might. And that the solution, actually, grief is grief itself. Grief and bereavement are dichotomous. Too often we have blended them together, meaning the same thing. And the idea is to separate them, and that in itself has been a breakthrough for some people, to realize that bereavement is an adjective based on fear, and that grief is a verb, an action thing that we can do based on love that breaks us through. And very quickly we talked about wailing and having convulsions, frightening when you see it. And our tendency is to rush in and stop it, and we've got to discuss that fact that we shouldn't be doing that. Keening and shuddering. Sobbing, crying, shaking, weeping, chattering, talking on incessantly about the loved one. So many times you've heard people say, look, I mean, it's time to move on. You've got to stop it talking about this person. And yet there's a need for that if they didn't do these things up front. And so there's a process, and by the way, laughter has to be recognized, because otherwise we can get all kinds of trouble.
I think it might be important to also mention to our viewers who maybe hadn't seen some of the other programs that we tend to either be coming from a fear mode or a love mode. And as you mentioned previously, if we are acting inappropriately, it's always based on fear. I think that was an interesting thing, and I've thought about that many times and used it often in my life when someone I encounter is behaving inappropriately, and it gives me instant compassion for them to be able to say, well, they're afraid of something.
And it allows you to stay in love mode rather than reacting and slipping on into the fear mode.
You want to help them instead of fight them or defend yourself.
Or at least be sympathetic.
Right, and you can always find that there is something that they're afraid of.
Oh,
always.
No question. Yeah.
And so, as you're saying here, bereavement is a fear mode as opposed to grief, which is being in the love mode.
And love overcomes fear. Love is the solution to fear. And so certainly we want to get over here if we can. Now, the very big ending of last show, we say now there's a process for this. A process that has evolved over the centuries that really should be honored rather than avoided. The other day I saw a TV commercial, for example, where they were talking about how to be able to have an immediate disposal, to just have a cremation, not to have to endure the pain and what have you. And this was logically their solution. And the truth of the matter is, you cannot sweep this process under the rug. That body is terribly important, you know what I mean? And to be able to confront. See, confrontation seems to be the key to peace. To be able to brush right up against something and to embrace it, to understand it, to work with it, is the best short-term solution to practically any problem if you stop and think about it. And so there is a process for this that should not be avoided. As a matter of fact, I'm going to slip this in here right now, and then we'll go on to the process. I don't think I mentioned this in the last two shows, but a William Gladstone, an English philosopher and theologian, actually, and a British statesman, said in the 18th century, "Show me the manner in which a nation or a community cares for its dead, and I will measure with mathematical exactness the tender mercies of its people, their respect for the laws of the land, and their loyalty to high ideals." Powerful. And we can see, because of the evolving shoulder-shrugging indifference we have to death, or our attempt to avoid it, what perhaps the society has devolved to. You know, a lot of pain, a lot of lawlessness, a lot of hopelessness.
The level of fear we're living in.
Exactly. And I think the manner in which we care for the dead has a lot to do with it. You see, you say, hey, it's just protoplasm. It's a body. That person's no longer there. Let's move on. You've heard these things.
Right.
Why in heaven's name, then, are they spending, and have in the past as well, millions of dollars retrieving bodies from airline crashes, for example? Some time ago, there was a flight, 800, TWA plane went down about 9 miles out, and they have spent untold amounts of money retrieving the bodies. That was a primary concern, because that's what's important. I don't recall, it's been a while since we did the shows, but I don't remember if I mentioned the funeral director, for example, who, when their funeral home burnt, the staff members came up on the scene and they said, "Where are the bodies? Where are the bodies?" And the firemen were letting them go because it was dangerous.
Right.
And they donned the garb and went down and went into the funeral home to save the bodies. People say, well, why? Because it's so meaningful, so important to the family. Can you imagine the trauma of the family who just lost Daddy, and now Daddy was burned in a fire?
Right.
And so they essentially risked their lives because they recognized the importance of this. In fact, death itself is terribly important. Philosophers, theologians, poets have been saying for centuries that not until we're comfortable with death and dying will we ever be totally comfortable with life and living, because it's an essential part of what we do. I have what might seem to be a trite saying. It has to be okay that people die. It has to be okay that I die, that you die. Because if it's not, then we got two problems. You're going to die, and then we have to deal with it. You know what I mean? And so
Absolutely.
If somehow we can understand and embrace this more, I think medical technology has placed us in a position where we fight to the last breath, even at the cost of severe pain and cost to someone else, holding on to what we sometimes refer to as the sanctity of life in order to avoid the death. Oftentimes doctors have difficulty with death. In fact, oftentimes they'll have a reputation for not looking at a patient when they're terminal. You mean they begin to separate themselves from this experience as a form of denial. The hospice work that's being done is incredible. In a hospice, it's where people can go. I mean, they're terminal, they're dying, there's no question. And there that can be addressed and discussed and examined, and you know what I mean? And people will embrace them, and it makes the passage much more comfortable. There's no question about that.
It seems to me that when we're discussing the issue of death, that not only do we have to consider ourselves with the loss of a loved one, but confronting our own mortality and the dealing with how that it's inescapable, that is going to happen, and how do we go on in the face of that. And I think, I don't think we spend a lot of time, for the most part, contemplating that.
I know.
And if we do, you know, we're morbid. There's something wrong with us.
Yeah, you're accused of morbidity.
Right, right.
Yeah. And I would say fly in the face of that. I've been to some death and dying seminars, for example, where we brush right up against it, where time was spent imagining ourselves decayed in the grave. I mean, in the mind process, imagining our parents, our mom and our dad in that state, and going through the anguish of that, and coming out on the other side going, wow, this feels better. I mean, because that's inevitable. That's what's going to happen, and it's terribly important. I think. I know this death and dying seminar was really incredible. There was a bonding that took place among that group that came out of authenticity, transparency with one another, and then when the time came, simple little exercises like getting under a sheet, for example, and being the cadaver, being the dead one, and having a funeral service was a truly meaningful experience. Really strange. And I came out of that, teary-eyed, misty-eyed for days, not out of sadness, but out of joy, appreciating life, its colors, its sounds. It was really an interesting experience, and everyone should be more comfortable with this process.
That's interesting that you would mention that. I imagine if we were more familiar with the feelings associated with with death, that we would appreciate life more.
That's right. Oh, yes.
But we go through, especially, I think, as youth, feeling like we're immortal.
And we are.
And we are. Yeah. And we don't confront the fact that the time we have here is limited. And really, in the words of Thoreau, suck the marrow out of life. Maybe that's something we need to consider.
Because, people have a way of dying on us. I mean, from the time they're conceived until a, quote, scheduled death, they have a way sometimes of just leaving us. Yeah. And if we're not prepared for that, it can be devastating, there's no question. I mentioned that seminar a while ago. I wanted to convey this. I do this in seminar, and people who are reviewing it, if I don't do it, they get all upset. For our viewing audience, this is a letter that I recommend that they might write. We were encouraged to do so, and everyone went to their cubby holes in their rooms, and I heard a lot of anguish. I heard tears, people addressing this issue. And what the assignment was in the seminar was to write or continue this letter that said, "Dearest blank." You can write this to anyone you like. I'm dying today. And before I die, I'd like you to know who I am. Oftentimes, if we don't let people know who we are, they tend to deify us. You ever notice, for example, when a young person is killed in high school, when you read it in the paper, that is the absolutely finest young person that probably ever lived. Yeah. With a bright future and this great mind and need to contribute, they were going to make a difference in the world, when in truth, it might have been just a typical rascal. Just trying to make his way through. Right. And yet we tend to deify, to elevate the dead in such a way, and it makes it harder to let go. Anyway, we're supposed to write the letter. I'm dying today, and before I die, I'd like you to know who I am. I went out by myself, and I thought and couldn't pick the one person I wanted to write the letter to. And my time was going, and I think they allowed us maybe 45 minutes to write the letter, perhaps an hour. And I used up most of it just thinking, well, who am I going to write the letter to?
Oh, yeah.
Because there's so many people in my life. You know what I mean? And what one is going to get this letter? And it wasn't happening, so I thought, well, I'll write a letter, and then I'll assign it. You know what I mean? I figured that'd be the best way. And this is what I wrote, if you'll allow me. I'm dying today, and before I die, I'd like you to know who I am. I was and am a lover. Not in a sensual sense, but in a spiritual sense. I love you. Yet, and I think you know this, if I were challenged to reveal who I love the most and had to tell the rigorous truth, I could not name just one, or two, 6, 20, or 100. It often seemed that there was a common amount, not distributed or doled out proportionately, but an accumulated feeling that existed for everyone I came to know. There was some similar amount for everyone, and that was always my blessing. Perhaps it would have been better if I'd never married and had children, thereby avoiding the apparent necessity of focusing, isolating, what most seem to want exclusive rights to and have expectations of. I admit to generally focusing on whoever I was with at the moment. Yet that never seemed to diminish my love for those absent. Perhaps you would have been happier or felt more complete if this were not so. But somehow I know that you understand that to not have all of one's love is not to be denied any of it. I wish there could have been more of whatever you needed. And my wish for you was everything. And then I signed it Burn, Mo, Dad, or Grandsir, whichever was applicable. and I went back here and put dearest everyone. So this is a letter to you and to everyone that I know. I mean, that's what that's about. But it identifies the fact that, and there's more to this perhaps as you read it than meets the eye on the surface. But it was a good exercise. It was a good exercise. And there is an exercise. Let's talk about things that have been made available to us in our society and our culture that accelerates us through the process that we tend somehow to not understand, we've been misled about, or whatever. There's a lot of things that happen. First of all, people will say, when I die, this is what I want. You know, I just want to be cremated and you scatter the ashes somewhere. I've got no business, I have no right to tell my loved ones what to do with my body. I don't know why we've allowed that. I've got no right to do that because I didn't lose me. You know what I'm saying? They have a loss, and maybe they have needs that need to be honored. And so we examine what some of those needs might be. And one of them is to confront the reality. Remember the other day I said that if you go into a funeral home, a complete stranger, and you walk up to the casket, that the body will move? That's a form of denial. To imagine if that was your baby, your sweetheart, your lover.
Yes.
You know what I mean? In other words, would there be movement? Oh, yes. And it's because there is, we tend to want to avoid it. And so we go into denial. Now, as if we don't confront this reality, we could get stuck and not even be aware of it. We do know this, that there is no measurement of a trauma, okay, greater than not being able to do this. In other words, doing it has never traumatized someone to the point where they couldn't recuperate. But not doing it has traumatized people where they didn't recuperate. You know what I'm saying? And so this is a process. If it's possible, within our range, the body is available, it should be prepared for viewing. Only because of the time that's involved. The body will begin to decompose very quickly. Mm-hmm. And so the preparation, actually the embalming process, and it need not be embalming if there's some religious issue about that. But certainly the body can be refrigerated to the point where it can last long enough to do certain things. Ideally, the body should be prepared for viewing. And then the bereaved, the one who's experiencing the greatest loss, should attend it, should be there with it, hour after hour after hour. Now, it's kind of fascinating. How long? It takes 72 hours. 72 hours to sever that silver strand that exists between two people that we refer to as a bond. 72 hours. Does that ring any bells with you, 72 hours? It's part of our heritage, our history. On the third day, he rose again from the dead.
Right.
The miracle of Lazarus was the fact that it was the fourth day that Jesus was reputed to have risen him from the grave. That was a miracle, because you see, in 72 hours, there's a major amount of decomposition that occurs, and the fact they made reference to that, of the stench of the body and what have you. And so 72 hours. And what I'm saying is that the bereaved should attend the body consistently, continually for 72 hours. Typically what happens, I talked to people this week. I said, was there a funeral? Was there an open casket? Yes. How much time did you attend the body? How much time were you there? Oh, maybe 10 minutes. Gina, it's not enough. It's not right. Now, sometimes if we're not careful, the funeral director of a funeral home will take over and say, well, the visiting hours are for 1 hour from 7 to 8 on Wednesday, you know? And we not knowing, you know, we kind of succumb to that. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is we should say, no, wait a minute. No, I'm going to be with my husband. I'm going to be with my child for this period of time. Because if we do this, within that 72 hours, there'll be a moment of release. A moment where you can comfortably reach up and close the casket lid and say goodbye. And it'll be the end of that part of it. Okay what I'm saying? But to attend it. Now, while you're there, there's some things you should be doing. We're rushing time here. I can't believe this. Anyway, while you're there, there's some things you should be doing. One is to forgive. We know, for example, that some of the hardest releases when there's unresolved issues. I think that's the way it was with my father. There was unresolved issues, and so I clung to him, hoping maybe in some subconscious way to be able to clean that up someday. And so while we're there, we forgive. You say, well, gee, I would have nothing to forgive. Oh, really? We all do. Everyone makes mistakes and disappoint us and what have you. And to be able to say, I forgive you, using the format that we used several weeks ago in Command Commission. In other words, I forgive you, I understand that when you did or said or did not do or say, that when you did not guide or when you misdirected, that at that point in your life that was the best you could do. You were in fear and therefore inappropriate, and I understand, and I forgive that, okay? But to forgive. Doesn't matter who it is. It can be a baby. It can be your daddy. It could be your brother. It could be anybody. To be able to go through and forgive them and make amends. In other words, you remember the time that I said or I did a certain thing? I'm sorry for that. And by the way, this should be done out loud, if possible. In other words, to talk out loud in the presence of the body. What's this all about? The subconscious mind doesn't know the difference between a real situation and a synthetic one. Remember we talked about that weeks ago. Okay, so as you're doing this, the subconscious is being assuaged. You're cleaning up the relationship, okay? In other words, and you're confronting the reality. And so the subconscious mind eventually will let go of the fear that causes the bereavement. Okay, I forgive you, I make amends. And then it's terribly important over and over and over again to actually say goodbye. Gina, you won't believe how many people I have talked to who have been in bereavement for years and never said goodbye. Just the two words, goodbye. They've talked in terms about passing over and I'll be with them later and these kinds of things, but they never said goodbye. There's a finality to that, I'll grant you. But it's the thing that comforts and assuages, like I say, the subconscious mind. Say goodbye, Daddy, or whatever that is, or goodbye, Paul, or whatever. But goodbye, and I love you, in present tense. In present tense, because don't you still?
Yes.
You see, people die,
Right.
but love doesn't. Mm-hmm. Okay, and to be able see, that's one of the mistakes I made with my father. For example, for years, 20 some odd years, I always professed how I loved my daddy. What does that mean? In a way, it means I don't anymore. I can't anymore, or I shouldn't anymore. And there's where the pain is. And it was when I actually said, goodbye, Daddy, I love you, okay? And it's comfortable for me to say that even today. I love you, is where some of the joy is in our relationship. Mm-hmm. It was easy to forgive him, certainly, when I began to understand what caused actually it wasn't inappropriate behavior, but a lack of appropriate behavior. The inability of him to not be able to say I love, and the awkwardness of not being able to touch. Those were major losses in my life, okay? And it made it hard for me to say goodbye to him or to let him go, okay?
What I see here is that you're telling me there's a tendency of people to want to cut off all their feelings as though their feelings died with the person, but they don't.
That's right.
Our feelings continue on with us.
Exactly.
Whatever happened, our experience with that person is a part of us, and so it doesn't stay with them, and we need to acknowledge that.
I know, for example, when I see the bereaved pain of the Olympic athlete as they cry about their granddaddy or their daddy who died and now is watching them in heaven and what have you, they're still in denial. And you don't want to take that wonderful thought of their being there away, except for a little while. This is a very tricky thing to say, and so I want everyone to listen very carefully, and don't hold me too close, okay, about this. But in this process, there is a little while, a day or two, when perhaps we would be well served to set aside our faith, our belief about the way it's going to be, and to take care of our mind, which is who we really are. To take care of all of that, to forgive and make amends and say goodbye and I love you, and to be there and to notice that indeed there is death here and that there is no continuance, and to let that go. And then after the services perhaps, then recapture. Be able to bring that back somehow if you need to. But this is terribly important.
Just letting them go.
That's right. The alternative can be horrible. I mean, I could go on, and probably will, with stories about when this hasn't been taken care of. But I know one thing: when I see it, I know what hasn't been done. Now, we are fortunate in one respect. It's certainly practical and certainly wonderful if we can have the body there. And the lengths that we go to achieve the body is evidence of that. After all, those were the eyes that cried, and those are the lips that smiled and perhaps kissed us, and those are the hands caressed us. They are important. And so when all of this is taken care of, but if it's not available, it can still be done in the privacy of the mind. Should be done out loud. That's the way I had to do it. I did it out loud, but my imagination created the casket. Mm-hmm. It went through all that process, and I was able to reach a point very quickly, as a matter of fact, very quickly. I think it's possible, if we can manage some of these things and understand them, that we can diminish grief, if almost not eliminate it. I mean, bereavement, and still not have a lot of grief.
Now, we would go through the same process for other types of losses, loss of a job, loss of a home, things like that.
Exactly. These things can be done in all manner of ways. I think it's important that we invite our audience back next week, because we're going to get into some real serious things here about some other facets of life and some other losses that we might have. But to know that this has been Life Talk. And rather than tune in at the same time next week, I suggest tuning in a half hour earlier. You know what I mean? Whatever time it is right now, tune in a half hour earlier and you'll catch the whole show. It's Life Talk, and our number is 1-800-661-3490. And if you'll call, we'll address your questions, send you a tape, and do everything we can to assist. And my name, by the way, is Vern
Moses.
Okay. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you, Vern.
We'll continue next week.
Great. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.